So check this out. It's October 6th, 2025. While every headline screams about Ukraine and Gaza, while the world's cameras point east, something far more strategic just happened quietly in West Africa. No one was watching. No one expected it. But in the small coastal nation of Togo, Russia just made a move that could flip the entire balance of power across the African continent. You see, this isn't just another diplomatic handshake or military promise. It's about access to the Atlantic. For the first time, the Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso now has a clear path to the sea, and it's not through French or American routes anymore. It's through Togo, a country of only 8 million people that suddenly holds the keys to a new African trade empire. And here's where it gets wild. Just 3 days before signing a defense pact with Russia, Togo quietly inked a customs deal with those same Sahel nations, the ones led by reformers like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest head of state on the continent, and the face of Africa's push for true sovereignty. So, what does this mean? A tiny nation just gave Russia a port on the Atlantic. The Sahel got a new lifeline. And Nigeria, the region's economic giant, just found itself surrounded. The world may have missed it, but history won't. Because what happened on October 6th wasn't just paperwork, it was a signal. A signal that Africa is done being the chessboard. It's ready to play the game on its own terms. So stay tuned, because tonight we're breaking down how this one deal between Russia and Togo could redraw the entire map of West Africa and what it means for the United States, for Europe, and for every African who still believes in freedom. Please share this if you believe that sovereignty begins with truth, not headlines, and subscribe if you're ready to see Africa's story told from the ground up. It began with a vote in Moscow, a quiet, almost procedural decision inside the Russian State Duma on October 6, 2025. But that single vote marked the start of a new chapter in African geopolitics. For the first time, Russia officially sealed a military and naval cooperation agreement with the tiny West African nation of Togo, a country that most maps barely highlight, yet one that now stands at the crossroads of a global power shift. The deal was more than just about soldiers or ships. It included joint military training, intelligence sharing, naval access, and most critically, a clause allowing Russian warships to dock freely at the port of Lomé, one of the busiest and most modern ports in all of West Africa. That clause changed everything. Because the port of Lomé isn't some fishing harbor, it's a deep-water gateway handling over 300 million tons of cargo in 2024, ranking among Africa's top 5. It operates 24/7, has advanced logistics systems, and just recently completed a massive expansion backed by the African Development Bank. In other words, Russia didn't just gain a friend, it gained a strategic oceanfront. But to understand the magnitude of this, we have to rewind 3 days earlier to October 3, 2025. While Moscow was preparing its vote, something equally significant happened in Lomé itself. Togo's government signed a customs integration deal with the Alliance of Sahel States, the new bloc formed by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso nations that had all expelled French troops and declared independence from the Western-controlled ECOWAS framework. Those 3 countries are landlocked, trapped by geography, rich in minerals, but poor in access. Together, they hold some of the world's largest reserves of uranium, gold, and lithium, but for decades, every ton of their wealth had to flow through French or Western-controlled ports. That meant endless delays, fees, and control from outside hands. Until now. This new customs deal opened a direct trade corridor from the Sahel to the Atlantic through Togo. It's not just symbolic. It's economic liberation, a quiet revolution built not with protests or weapons, but with paperwork, policy, and ports. And the timing couldn't have been more deliberate. Just months earlier, France had completed its military withdrawal from West Africa after 65 years of presence. The old colonial guardian was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum stretching from the deserts of Mali to the coasts of Ghana. Russia saw the gap and moved fast. Under the radar, Russian diplomats and logistics corporations began investing in Togo's infrastructure, dredging deeper channels, expanding docking basins, and setting up joint training facilities. Officials like Vladimir Guzv and Ambassador Igor Edvokimov spoke publicly about building maritime confidence and ensuring regional stability, diplomatic language masking a far bigger ambition, a foothold on the Atlantic. Meanwhile, within the Alliance of Sahel States, leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso championed the deal as a triumph of sovereignty, proof that African nations could bypass Western systems entirely. To Traoré, this was more than trade. It was justice delayed, but finally delivered. For decades, African resources, gold, oil, uranium, left the continent cheaply enriching outsiders. Now, for the first time, those same nations are writing their own trade routes with partners of their choosing. So when Togo opened its customs gate to the Sahel, it wasn't just a transaction. It was a declaration. A declaration that Africa's geography would no longer be its prison. Together, these two agreements, one military, one economic, have created a chain reaction that is reshaping the region. From Moscow to Lomé and from Ouagadougou to Niamey, the message is clear: Africa is recharting its borders not on paper but in power. The tension rose fast, not with gunfire but with silence. 3 days. That's all it took for Togo to go from a quiet coastal nation to the epicenter of a geopolitical storm. The customs deal of October 3rd and the military pact of October 6th fit together like two halves of a weapon, one economic, one strategic. Together they gave the Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso what they had been denied for more than half a century: a route to the Atlantic Ocean free from foreign control. For decades, their gold, uranium, and cotton flowed out through ports owned or regulated by France and Western corporations. Every shipment meant taxes, fees, and dependence. But now, through Lomé, everything changed. When the ink dried, the atmosphere in West Africa shifted. In Abuja, Nigeria's capital, alarm bells rang. In Paris, analysts whispered about the loss of France's final anchor in West Africa. And in Washington, the Pentagon quietly ordered an assessment: could Russian naval assets soon appear 200 miles from Lagos? The numbers were shocking. Togo's port, newly linked to Sahel trade, was already processing cargo 4 times faster than Nigeria's congested ports. Within 1 quarter, Nigeria's exports to Togo skyrocketed 6-fold, not because Togo's population suddenly demanded more goods, but because traders were rerouting cargo through Lomé's efficient customs system. That single metric revealed the truth: Nigeria, once the unchallenged economic king of West Africa, was being outmaneuvered. Then came the diplomatic aftershocks. Nigeria's foreign minister Yusuf Tuggar warned that Russia's growing influence could destabilize the region. In Ghana, officials scrambled to call Washington, negotiating a fresh defense agreement to reinforce regional stability. Within weeks, the U.S. ambassador to Togo, Richard Michaels, made a highly publicized visit to the port of Lomé, praising its world-class infrastructure and promising American investment. But everyone knew what was really happening. It wasn't about investment, it was containment. The United States was trying to slow the spread of Moscow's influence across the Gulf of Guinea. In Paris, the French Foreign Ministry called the Russia-Togo pact a provocation. But there was little they could do. France's troops had already been expelled from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and public opinion across Africa had turned sharply against them. Meanwhile, on the streets of Lomé, something unexpected was happening. Crowds began gathering near the port, waving flags, chanting, "Sovereignty, sovereignty for Africa." A local newspaper poll found that 54% of Togolese citizens supported leaving ECOWAS to join the Sahel Alliance. It wasn't just governments shifting sides, it was hearts and minds. To ordinary Africans, this wasn't about Russia or America. It was about finally owning their roads, their ports, and their future. Back in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré addressed a crowd in Ouagadougou. "We are not turning to Russia to serve them. We are turning to each other to serve Africa." His words were met with thunderous applause. For many across the Sahel, Traoré had become the symbol of a generation determined to break every colonial chain, political, financial, and now maritime. But beneath the celebration lay unease. Could these new alliances truly remain African-led, or would Moscow's presence bring a new form of dependency? Even as Russian cargo ships prepared to dock at Lomé under the New Deal, American satellites tracked every movement. European media began calling this the new Cold War in Africa. In just a few weeks, West Africa's balance of power, once steady under ECOWAS and Western oversight, was in flux. New routes, new partners, new ambitions, all born from 2 signatures on 2 different days. And at the center of it all stood a young leader in fatigues, Ibrahim Traoré, not a superpower, not a millionaire, but a soldier with a conviction: Africa must no longer be observed, it must be heard. That conviction now echoed from the deserts of Mali to the harbors of Togo, a whisper turning into a storm. The shockwaves didn't just stay in parliaments and embassies, they spread through markets, factories, and border towns. In the weeks following the Togo-Russia agreement, truck convoys began lining up at border checkpoints between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Togo. For the first time, Sahelian goods, gold, cotton, sesame, uranium were flowing directly toward the Atlantic, bypassing the old colonial trade routes. The people on the ground could feel it. Merchants in Ouagadougou, who once paid layers of transit taxes to get their exports through French-controlled ports, now paid half the cost, sometimes less. For them, this wasn't just geopolitics, it was relief. In Lomé, dockworkers spoke of night shifts, doubling cargo cranes never resting, and new contracts signed weekly. The African Development Bank projected the port's revenue could triple within a year, creating thousands of jobs. Local businesses called it a second independence. For decades, Togo had lived in the shadow of regional powers. Now it was becoming the gateway to a sovereign Sahel. But with prosperity came pressure. Nigeria, the regional heavyweight, was bleeding money. Economists estimated losses of hundreds of billions of naira in customs duties as cargo rerouted through Togo. Ports in Lagos and Port Harcourt saw their traffic drop by 40%. Truckers and dock workers protested the delays, blaming corruption and government negligence. One veteran driver summed it up, "We're losing jobs not to war, but to mismanagement." Politically, the landscape was shifting just as fast. The ECOWAS bloc, once the proud symbol of regional unity, was unraveling. 3 of its members, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, had already left. Now polls showed growing support in Togo, even in Guinea, for following the same path. In Western capitals, diplomats whispered the same question: is this the beginning of the end for ECOWAS? Meanwhile, the Alliance of Sahel States AS began acting less like a temporary coalition and more like a proto-union. Joint military drills, shared customs systems, even early talks of a new common currency. Every initiative drew the Sahel nations closer and further away from the West's economic orbit. Inside Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré's approval ratings soared. His message of sovereignty through unity was resonating far beyond his borders. Even in cities like Bamako and Niamey, murals of Traoré began appearing beside images of Sankara and Lumumba. To many, he was the modern heir to their unfinished revolutions. But not everyone was celebrating. Civil society groups in Togo and Niger warned of over-reliance on Moscow. They remembered history, how one foreign power often replaced another. A Togolese activist said on local radio, "We welcome trade with Russia, but we must guard our soul. Independence is not for sale." That tension between pride and caution, progress and dependency, defined the months that followed. African youth waved flags calling for self-determination, while older generations whispered about balance and patience. In the halls of ECOWAS headquarters in Abuja, silence replaced strategy. No one could deny it anymore. A new axis of power was emerging from Ouagadougou to Lomé, united not by treaties from Paris or Washington, but by a shared promise: we will control our own future. The map of West Africa was still the same on paper, but politically, psychologically, it had already changed forever. From Washington to Paris, the Togo-Russia pact landed like a thunderclap. It wasn't just about ships docking at a distant African port. It was about who controls access to the Atlantic Ocean and who gets to write the next chapter of global trade. In Washington, D.C., intelligence briefings began to circulate under a new headline: Russia's Southern Atlantic Corridor. For American strategists, the alarm wasn't just the presence of Russian troops or advisors, it was the symbolism. After decades of seeing Africa as an aid recipient, the world was now watching nations like Togo and Burkina Faso negotiate as equals. And Russia, through its African core, had positioned itself as the willing partner for that new reality. The U.S. response was swift but cautious. Within days, the State Department reaffirmed its commitment to West African stability, dispatching envoys to Ghana, Benin, and Senegal, countries still aligned with the West. Behind closed doors, American defense officials were even more direct. The move threatened to undermine decades of U.S. maritime strategy along the Gulf of Guinea, a corridor vital for global oil and cargo flows. At the Pentagon, analysts warned that if Moscow secured permanent docking rights at Lomé, it could soon establish surveillance and logistics stations, effectively giving Russia a blue water presence in the South Atlantic, something it had never achieved during the Cold War. In Paris, the reaction was more emotional than strategic. Editorials in Le Monde and Libération described the deal as the final collapse of France's West African sphere. For the first time since the 1960s, French companies were being replaced by Russian and Chinese contractors, not in war, but in contracts, ports, and power grids. The CFA franc, France's long-standing economic lever, suddenly looked obsolete in a region exploring its own financial systems under Sahel leadership. Meanwhile, Beijing stayed publicly silent, but its economic arms were already moving. Chinese shipping firms and banks began quietly exploring new partnerships in Lomé and Ouagadougou, seeing opportunity where the West saw threat. To them, Russia's footprint opened doors for infrastructure cooperation and potential competition with Western giants. At the United Nations, the divide was unmistakable. Western delegates spoke of security concerns and foreign interference, while African representatives countered with a single phrase repeated again and again: sovereignty is not interference. That sentiment resonated beyond Africa. Latin American diplomats compared it to their own battles against foreign dominance. Middle Eastern leaders saw echoes of the Suez Canal crisis. The world was no longer watching Africa through the old colonial lens, it was watching a continent negotiating its own destiny. For the United States, this presented a paradox. Publicly, Washington reaffirmed its respect for African independence. Privately, it feared that independence might now speak Russian. By late October 2025, think tanks in Washington began publishing reports with titles like "A New Cold War in the Gulf of Guinea" and "How Russia Outflanked the West in West Africa." The tone was uneasy, almost bewildered, because this time the shift hadn't come from coups or conflicts. It came from contracts, customs, and cooperation, the instruments of modern sovereignty. And in that quiet transformation, the balance of global power had tilted, not through war, but through the reclaiming of African agency. So here we are, October 2025. A small nation few had ever mentioned on the evening news has just altered the balance of an entire continent. Togo. Not through war, not through rebellion, but through strategy, through courage. The Togo-Russia pact, combined with the Sahel customs revolution, has done something no foreign army ever managed to do in Africa. It reversed the direction of power. For the first time in modern history, landlocked nations Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso can trade with the world on their own terms. They no longer need the permission of Paris or Washington. And that is history. But history never comes without a cost. For every flag waving in celebration, there is a family wondering if this independence will truly last. Because Africa has walked this road before, from promises of freedom to decades of hidden control. This time, the danger isn't invasion, it's influence. Will Moscow respect African sovereignty or simply repaint the same colonial map in different colors? Will nations like Nigeria, left isolated and struggling, be drawn into conflict or renewal? And will the United States, once a distant observer, now learn to listen instead of dictate? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are the choices that will define the next 50 years of African and global politics. What's unfolding today in Lomé, Ouagadougou, and Niamey is more than a trade realignment, it's a moral test for the world. Because true sovereignty isn't just about ports or military bases, it's about dignity, equality, and the right to dream without permission. Captain Ibrahim Traoré once said, "We cannot keep asking for freedom from those who profit from our captivity." That line echoes far beyond Burkina Faso. It echoes through every nation that has ever been told its fate must be decided elsewhere. So as the new map of Africa is drawn not in ink but in resolve, we must all ask ourselves, are we witnessing liberation? Or just a quieter kind of control? Either way, the tide has turned, and the next wave is already building. If you've made it this far, you already know the world's future is being decided where few are looking. Please share if you believe that African nations deserve to trade freely, leave proudly, and choose their own partners. Subscribe if you believe that the whole truth still matters more than the headlines, because this story isn't over. It's just beginning, and this time, Africa is holding the pen.